الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله وصلى اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين النبي الأمين سيد المرسلين المحمد المصطفى وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه الغر الميامين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد وهو على كل شيء قدير الحمد لله الذي جعلنا من المتمسكين بولاية الثقلين كتاب الله وعترة أهل بيت النبي صلى الله عليه وآله والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. I want to begin this first sermon by offering congratulations to this year's graduates. There are many graduates in my personal life that I'm very proud of. I'm very proud of the work that they have put in. It is not a small achievement to graduate, whether it be high school, undergraduate, or graduate school. Although I do want to add that education and learning does not begin and stop in our educational institutions. Our educational institutions are deeply flawed, but nonetheless, they provide structure and milestones for us as a society and as individuals to grade ourselves and to chart our progress as human beings and as Muslims. A number of friends of mine are on the cusp of graduating or have graduated. My dear friend Rami is towards the end of his PhD, and he will, inshallah, successfully defend his thesis in the coming months. My dear friend Vitska is towards the end of her SJD and is in a similar situation. Another dear friend of mine, Dalal, has completed her undergraduate degree. And of course, my dear friend Sharif, who has completed a degree in psychology. Very inspiring individuals. And I feel lucky to take part in their success. We had an interesting conversation, a funny conversation amongst ourselves about the idea of whether or not one should walk in a graduation, especially when it's at an institution like the Ohio State University, which has thousands of graduates on a single day. It's a very exhausting time. Everyone tries to park and run to the right place and find a seat and do all of the graduation day rituals that there are. And part of the ritual is the idea of commencement, that graduation is not the end, but it is the beginning. It is the commencing of the future of our generations, that the fruit of the labor that was put into their education in the period of time, 4, 5, 6 years or longer, has come to an end, but is also the beginning for our society, as those educated individuals will then take part and nourish our society and help grow our society for the better. But after attending graduations for the last 10, 15 years, it's very rare that I come across a commencement speech that really inspires. And that's what it's really supposed to do. It's supposed to inspire the student to look forward and to think, to what direction shall I set my GPS? What is my trajectory moving forward? What do I have to offer? And what does the world have to offer me? But many of these commencement speeches have become routine and ritual and quite uninspiring. And so one might think and forgive a commencement speaker who does their very best to switch it up and to bring change, something that might invigorate the youth who are now educated and are going to contribute to the educated milieu. Well, this year's Ohio State commencement speaker had precisely this idea. His name is Chris Pan, and he is a so-called, well, I don't know what this means, but he says that he is a social entrepreneur. When I looked into him, my advice to Sharif and Dalal and others was, I don't think that you'll miss much at commencement this year. Unfortunately, I was right. Now, I don't necessarily know that I would do a better job, but please accept this as a commencement speech nonetheless. Maybe there's something of value. Inshallah. But by the way, I would also like to congratulate Vitska on her second album and now 31 entries in her blog about birds and about the Quran and about life. If you haven't read her blog, do yourself a favor and spend some time going through the entries. It's really something special. So this individual, Chris Pan, he's a founder of a company called My Intent, which apparently makes bracelets with a customer-chosen word that helps the wearer to live intentionally. If you don't know what that means, well, neither do I, and I'm not going to be able to explain it to you. Mr. Pan proudly proclaimed that he was relying on psychedelics in order to aid his creative process for this most important speech, and cited to the likes of other entrepreneurs. I don't know if it's true or not, but other entrepreneurs, famous entrepreneurs of the past, and said they relied on LSD and psychedelics and ayahuasca and all kinds of things. Well, what you might imagine took place when you try to put together a speech while on psychedelics. The result was a speech that I could not stomach enough to get through, despite its 15 to 17 minutes length. I tried my very best, but I couldn't do it. It included sing-alongs, strange stretching type movements that he forced the entire crowd to do along with him, a Navy SEAL breathing exercise, an awkward magic trick with the president of the university who very clearly didn't want to be involved, and then eventually shilling on behalf of Bitcoin, which resulted in the booing of the vast majority of the crowd of 70,000 people. After this spectacular embarrassment, for himself and for the school, a school as prestigious as the Ohio State University, naturally, the media wanted to get sound bites from him and asked him all kinds of questions. What did Mr. Pan do? He doubled down. He doubled down by giving an extremely arrogant set of interviews that essentially blamed the crowd for being too close-minded to understand what he was saying and lacking having an ineptitude for listening comprehension. In fact, he took the time to make it all about himself and about his feelings and emotions. He said, that was the hardest day of my life, being booed like that by so many people. And who did he decide to empathize with most? He said, now I know how politicians feel. Must be so hard. The more I read about this individual, the less I wanted to know. So congratulations on your hard-earned degree and all of the tuition money that you spent. The Ohio State University apparently doesn't really care about you that much. That's very sad. I hope that they come around to understanding that the way to get into the news should not include boring and embarrassing their graduates, and definitely not beating them and arresting them mere days before for expressing a political opinion on a patch of grass. But let's digress from that. I make mention of this individual because I believe that we all, or at least I, have seen a growing trend in our society. Somehow, commercialization has managed to overtake even the spirit of punk philosophy. I'm using punk philosophy, maybe it's very outdated, but punk philosophy in the meaning of non-conformity, a culture of non-conformity that was built out of aversion to authoritarianism, aversion to imperialism, to corporatism, to classism, etc. Alas, the empire has managed to commodify and swallow through its machine even the nonconformity movement as well. The nonconformity movement meant something. It opposed something that was deeply wrong in our institutions. To me personally, there's something incredibly ugly about modern art, about modern music, about modern fashion. It's disconnected from meaning. And I think that that is the pollution that commercialization has entered into that modicum, that medium. Commercialization bastardizes everything that it touches and finds a way to commodify it without fully understanding what it's commodifying. It doesn't care what it's commodifying as long as it turns a profit. And it doesn't care how badly it distorts the art form as long as it turns a profit. While I watched Mr. Carter, President Carter, who was a very serious man, be forced to blow on another man's hand while doing a magic trick, not once, but twice, not once and not twice, but 3 times. I could see the disdain in his face for being forced to do it. But he was prepared to do it nonetheless, because he is a corporate slave. Now, this thesis, however, regarding this cultural Frankenstein that we have created, the belief that something that can come from nothing, is not necessarily new. But what is interesting about it is any time that you tend to criticize this idea of something coming from nothing, especially in terms of all art forms, you're usually met with accusations of being old-fashioned, or of being grouchy, or being uninspired and boring, or even someone who just simply doesn't understand art or beauty. But personally, I am all for innovation. Any field that is not innovative is trending towards death and irrelevance. But I'm also very personally convinced of the need for laying of the foundation of intentionality and diligent construction of moral trajectory. I want to turn your attention to Surah Al-Ahqaf. Surah Al-Ahqaf is a very foundational surah, and it belongs to the class of the surahs known as the Hawamim, and it has a very foundational message. The core of its message is about foundation, in fact. Whether your foundations are upon strong structures or are they upon weak structures. Now, when trying to understand a surah like this, I would find it extremely difficult if I did not have the resource, which is the tafsir that is known as Project Illumine. I wouldn't know how to read the surah. I wouldn't know what to look for. But when you look through the tafsir, you will find that no exegetes have made the insight that has been made in the Project Illumine tafsir regarding what the Ahqaf are. Yes, people have talked about it. They've tried to say it's in a particular region, it's sand dunes that are in a particular region between Hadramaut and somewhere else. And that is how it was, and it's very, very kind of, but not a understanding, a moral and metaphorical and metaphysical understanding of why name it Ahqaf. There's 35 verses in there that vary in length, but why name it Ahqaf? It's only this tafsir that delves into that. To share with you the conclusion of it is that Ahqaf, the idea of the Ahqaf are sand dunes. And if you build your life's philosophy on something unstable, like sand dunes, sand shifts, it moves, it grows, and it shrinks. It's not solid like rock or concrete. It has no real foundation. Try to stack anything on top of it. You may be able to get a little bit, go up for a while, but eventually it will fall over and it will die. And you'll have to start all over again. Or you'll have to train your mind, your perception, to see it differently. Ahqaf has a numerous amount of sections in it. It's between 5 to 6 different sections. But there is a verse, actually it's the very final verse, that provides a lot of context for the surah itself. Just backing up very quickly, Ahqaf was revealed at a time towards the end of the Meccan period, but nonetheless it was around the time when the Prophet and his closest disciples had faced a lot of adversity and persecution and difficulty while trying to relay the message and partially also convince the Meccan polity about the truth of the message of the Quran. That involved persecution and sanctions, financial hardships, alienation from family, living on the margin, you name it. They faced it. But the end of the surah says, فَاصْبِرْ كَمَا صَبَرَ أُولُو الْعَزْمِ مِنَ الرُّسُلِ وَلَا تَسْتَعْجِلْ لَهُمْ. Which roughly translates to remain then as the messengers of old were endowed with firmness of heart and bore themselves with patience, and seek not to hasten doom on them who still deny the truth. And then it continues and says, on the day when they see that which they are promised, it will seem to them as though they had tarried but an hour of daylight, a clear message. Shall any be destroyed save the iniquitous folk? Well, when you break that verse down into its parts, you see a number of different messages in one ayah. The first part is telling the reader to be patient and persistent. It's telling you who to emulate. It's telling you this is not the first time that somebody has been asked to be patient and persistent through this task. This is what the messengers of old had to do. So you're in good company. And it says, don't rush it. Now, people who translate or who do the tafsir tend to focus on the part where don't rush their doom closer to them. And I think that is helpful to know. But I think there's a number of understandings to keep in mind while reading that command. Don't rush. And don't rush onto them. It doesn't even say the doom, per se. But don't rush them. Don't rush them. Now, when you know something that's true, and you know something that has urgent appeal, something that's very important, what is the human thing to do? You want to share it with the people that you care about the most. And you want to share it urgently. And you want to communicate it in a way that gets the message across urgently. And you're waiting to hear back from them quickly that they've understood what it is you're trying to get them to understand. So if they look back at you plainly, you start to get frustrated. If they ignore you, you get frustrated. You take it personally. You feel alienated. It's very difficult. And in the worst case scenario, they reject you in a very violent and unkind way. And you take that personally. And what is the natural conclusion of being on the receiving end of that? You separate yourself. You don't want to be around. Though I do believe that separating oneself for periods of time is probably a healthy option. But the point is, you separate yourself from the mission. You kind of let the mission slip through your hands, like sand, because it feels too painful to keep trying. That is the final verse of the surah. But I want to tell you about some of the other sections, especially the first 3 sections. There's 5 or 6 of them, but I want to focus on the first 3 sections as briefly as I possibly can. There are several points that are laid out in the first section. One of the main ones is that material existence and its framework is not eternal, and it will eventually come to an end. The entire material matrix is constructed with the power of truth and its responsible subservience to the attributes of divinity. It's built by al-Haqq. Literally it says the sky, the skies, and the earth, and that which is between it, is built by Haqq. And it is there for a term appointed, ajali musamma. It is going to end, but it is built on Haqq. Haqq is what? Beyond truth. It is a material, moral responsibility. Everything acts responsibly as the way that it was created. In acknowledgement of its creation, it has the duty and the responsibility. The sky is not allowed to fall and collapse upon the earth. It must do its job because it is subservient. It is created to acknowledge its subservience. When things go wrong with the natural order of things, it's not because God set it in motion that way necessarily. But as we can see by the way that we treat our planet, it is because of our own decision making. It is because we are not subservient. We have put ourselves in the shoe, we are usurpers. We have put ourselves in the position of God, the natural order. God then speaks to those who are turning away from the truth and implores them to engage Him with a logic of their own that can challenge the Quran with some book or a vestige of knowledge that might even attempt to compete with the framework of the Quran on its merits. God then informs them that their rationale is very sadly misguided and that the day of accountability is coming much faster than they realize. Take note of this idea of time returning over and over. Time, a lot of time, and a short amount of time. It being warped, that there is this difference of sometimes it feels like you have forever, and sometimes it feels like there's forever, but other people think that they have forever, and you see time ticking away like this. The Prophet says that it's the time between now and the end of Judgment Day is the distance between two fingers. I don't know if it is a credible hadith or not, but it illustrates the point that when you awake, as the final verse said, when you awake on the Day of Judgment, you'll feel that you had been on earth just but a few days, not a full lifetime. Okay, so it's important to recognize what then do the opponents of the Quran say that is recorded in the Quran, and why does the Quran give it record? They bring a number of different arguments, and those arguments show up in different surahs. But in this context, they say that the Quran is either sorcery, it's either magic, or that it's entirely fabricated. Why those things, and why focus on those things? Think back again to the commodification of nonconformity. At its core, these types of arguments are made to level the playing field amongst competing ideologies. You see, if I can tell you that, well, that's your opinion and this is mine, that means everything is subjective. Who is the winner? Well, it depends on if you're using the bigger stick theory, then your argument wins. But if you're in an open forum in which you are conversing with one another, who is the winner? The one who has the more pizzazz and argument, the more lawyerly appeal, the more dramatic flair, the more airtime. There's a number of different things. Or even the one who has a more sound argument, perhaps. But the Quran completely rejects this notion. It rejects it in whole. It says, no, your subjectivities are your constructions that you are placing on top of reality. You are forcing your understanding backwards. It's a reverse engineering. You've made a conclusion, you've built your structure, and now you're forcing a foundation underneath it. That simply isn't true. Either gravity exists or it does not. You cannot debate it. You can try, but eventually everyone gave up. It's a law at this point. Doesn't mean that people know how the law works, but it is a law. And the law of existence is that existence came from a creator. And when the creator created that existence, he set it in motion with laws. Part of those laws are that God has divine attributes, and he has made those divine attributes available to be learned by the intuition of the human being, which is what sets the human being above the angels. That human being cannot remember because of their own obstinate obstruction by way of their ego and personal self-centrism and you name it. They have forgotten it. Their fitrah is dry and demanding to be watered. But the more that it sits there dry, the more it just blows around like a sand dune. No, the Quran doesn't let you off easily. It says, this is the reality. You are a servant. You are born to serve. And regardless of what you choose to serve, you will serve. Do not think that because you have said to yourself, I serve only me, that you are serving yourself. In fact, you are a deviant. You're deviating from the natural course of reality. In response to these disparaging accusations, against the Quran and against the Prophet and against God himself, the Prophet is ordered to demonstrate his foundation of humility. Humility that is required of one who has acknowledged and realized their position as a servant vis-a-vis God. Furthermore, the Prophet is instructed to respond to the claim that the Quran is an innovation by reminding the opposition or those who are opposing his message of the book of Musa, that this is not the first time that you've heard something like this. This is a moral book that is telling you how to build a moral foundation upon which you can build a moral structure that will not blow away, that will not collapse, because the foundation is sound. That is why this section is concluded with the main dhikr, the main invocation of the surah, which is إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهَ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا فَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ, which is to say, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهِ is those who say that God is my protector, my raiser, my upbringer, the source of all my reliance. And God, to me as I read it, God being all of the attributes that are godly, beauty and justice and kindness and righteousness, all of the names that you can think of, recognizing that you are subservient to that God, ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا, that is your service. ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا means, and then they stood firm. But standing firm means being on the path and the trajectory of affirming God's attributes through your actions. And the natural result of that is that you will not, when you are standing for God and God's attributes, you will not be dissuaded and deterred by the feelings of anxiousness and the feelings of fear. Anxiousness and fear will not be your gods. They will not guide your decisions. Fear and anxiety are at the center core of one's ego. The ego is built up to deal with fear and anxiety. But the funny thing about ego is, if you feed it with self-aggrandizement, it will grow. And if you lash it with self-mutilation, it will swell and grow. Either way, it will grow. And if it grows, so too does your fear and your anxiety. Then what do? Your ego rules you and tells you you need more things. You need more influence. All for what reason? To protect yourself and to protect your loved ones. Look at any hungry dog, cat, or most animals. What is the first thing that they do when something changes in their environment? They tend to protect their resources. And they may even come off vicious, despite the fact that a mere few seconds before it, they were lovable little children, the most innocent looking animal that would remind you of a baby. But the moment they feel the fear, their reptilian brain turns on and they resort to feeding the ego in order to protect themselves against fear and anxiety. In the second sermon, we'll continue with some reflections on the surah, inshallah, and then close. Astaghfirullah li wa lakum, astajibullah la astajib lakum. As'alullah astajib lakum. Astaghfirullah al-azim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Subhana rabbika Rabbil Izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursaleen. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. In the second section of the 3 sections that I wanted to, as briefly as possible, review in this surah, there's a section which discusses the role of parents and the relationship between parents and children, specifically, and the family structure, specifically parents who are believing parents. And there's this famous, and it happens a few times, of course, in the Quran, but in this part, there's this famous point where Allah says, don't be of the children who says to your parents, uff. Don't be rude. Don't disregard them or belittle them. And this point is rightfully stated quite often. And I think it tends to, possibly, I don't know, I'm not a parent, but I think it tends to dominate a parent's mind when they read this verse. And so oftentimes I think it's overstated, this point about you must be very careful not to say to your parent, uff, etc., etc. But the context in which the child is saying uff is very specific. There's verses 15 and 17 that I want to just quickly read to you, so you maybe take note of this motif of time again. Verse 15, it says, "And we have enjoined man to be virtuous unto his parents. His mother carried him in travail, or difficulty, and bore him in travail, and his gestation and weaning is 30 months, such that when he reaches maturity," again time, "and such that when he reaches maturity and reaches 40 years, he says, My Lord, inspire me to give thanks for thy blessing, with which thou hast blessed me and hast blessed my parents, and that I may work righteousness such that it pleases thee, and make a righteous for me my progeny. Truly I turn in the repentance to thee, and truly I am amongst those who submit." Okay? There's another verse here, 16, that I'm just going to pass through it because it's like a continuation. And then there's verse 17. And says, "As for one who says to his parents, Fie upon you both, uffin lakum, uffin lakuma. Do you promise me that I shall be brought forth when generations have passed away before me?" They argue with their parents. "While they call upon God for succor," while they being calling upon God for closeness, istighatha, they are reliant on God, the parents. "They say to their children, Woe unto you, believe. Waylak," they say. Amin, waylak, amin. It's a very emotional kind of response. It's like they're almost a little bit, not annoyed, but they're frustrated. Ya waylak, what do I have to do to get this across to you? They confirm the truth of reality. Amin, surely God's promise is true. And the child then responds and says, "This is not but the fables of those of old." Again, a reference to time. Old fables, things that are long gone. They don't apply to me anymore. Look again here. As for the one who says to his parents, You promise me that I shall be brought forth where the generations have passed away before me. Generations are gone. These are old things. They don't apply. What about the 2 verses before it? It's talking about the time that it takes to carry a child. 9 months of difficulty, strenuous process on the body and the physiology and the psychology. And then the birthing process itself. The pangs of birth are famous for being very difficult, and that only mothers can really have the true power and patience to undergo them. And then the process of breastfeeding the child and raising the child from scratch when they are an infant, and teaching them how to walk, and teaching them how to talk, and teaching them their base morals, building their foundation, being patient with them and not striking them when they're upset or whatever it is. Time, it takes time. And God is saying, I see that. And then he says something amazing. He says, then the man or the woman doesn't reach maturity or it's not a rule, but the point is such that when he reaches maturity at 40 years of age, then he or she gets around to saying, wow, I was really blessed that I was raised in this house. I was really blessed that I was raised by this woman. Or at minimum, I was really blessed that this woman took care of me and fed me and clothed me and carried me when I was, an unborn child. And sees it for what it is. And then says, the way that I want to show my thanks and my gratitude is to work righteousness. That's what it says. And that I may work righteousness, such that it pleases thee. The foundation of this mature now individual is that they want to build a life that is centered around pleasing God's will and his attributes and upholding God's attributes. And then sees the real challenge of raising a child. So what is the natural supplication that they make? They say, I pray that I have offspring that are in turn righteous and patient towards me as a parent. Because again, not being a parent, but observing parents have a very, very difficult job. They balance a lot, and they balance themselves with their children and their lives, but they also can't help but put their children in front of their own comfort. Everything that they do is they're thinking of their children first, which is amazing because it almost competes with their relationship with God. That is a challenge in and of itself, a very difficult challenge. But these parents who is in this book are the ones who are reliant on God. It uses the word istighatha. They are purely reliant. They call only on God. They don't rely on any other function or foundation. Their foundation is only on God, even when it comes to a difficult moment when their child is taking up nonconformity. And you know what? Maybe they're taking nonconformity for a reason that makes sense. Look at the way the world is today. I told myself that I'm honestly not prepared to talk about Palestine and Sudan today. And I'm not going to, because I just don't have it in me. And I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say anymore. And I'm shocked when somebody comes and says something worth listening to about it all. Because it's very clear that our community has been out of ideas for months, a long time. We broke the seal on, wow, that was a great khutbah, because it sounded slightly political, or slightly like with some backbone of like, oh, hey, you can't treat Palestinians like that. And everyone's like, oh my God, this is the most amazing khutbah I've ever heard in my whole life. Then imagine how bad the khutbahs were before that. No, I'm not going to talk about it today because I don't have anything to offer. I don't know how to process that level of pain and how to give you something to treat the pain with. I don't know. Maybe it's relying on surahs like this, where we build our foundation brick by brick, very patiently. We don't skip steps. Yes, what is happening right now is a big problem, and we need a short-term solution. But if you rely on a short-term solution, if you're not careful, you are going to build the foundation of your resistance on your own ego. What does the ego do? It protects fear and anxiety. And then it feeds and feeds and feeds, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Like the way a root that goes under a concrete or a sidewalk. When you put down the sidewalk at first, maybe it's flat, but give it a little bit of time, that sidewalk is going to come off of the ground. And you're going to have a big task ahead of you, having to move that huge block, break it into small pieces because it's too heavy, cut the root, discard it, do all kinds of work to then lay back down another foundation. Why not do it right the first time? For us who are watching that, we have to be patient, and we have to encourage them patiently and encourage ourselves patiently. From a child's perspective, they see a lot of meaninglessness. But if they don't have a foundation, they will fight meaninglessness with meaninglessness because they're just picking and choosing. They're not really sure what to rely on. So 40 years it takes to get to this place of maturity. The third section and the final section is the section about Prophet Hud's warning of the people of Ad. This is where the invocation or the mention of the Ahqaf, the sand dunes, comes. So these folk, the Ad folk, we are not listening to the warnings of Prophet Hud, who is trying to alert them to the real realities of the way that the world and the universe is constructed, that they are servants, that they need to fall into subservience to the attributes of God. And they don't listen. But they're enduring a drought, and they're praying for the drought to be served or solved with some rain. They're in, again, desert environment. So they see these clouds that are approaching. Everybody knows the story. And they say, oh, great, look, we were right, you were wrong, Hud. Look, we are being blessed with some sort of material sustenance, because the way the world works is if you get material sustenance, it means God is on your side and you're the chosen one, and you get to then choose whatever the heck you want to choose. And if you don't have the resources, sorry for you, and I'm just going to bully you for as long as I possibly can. Well, what was in the clouds? The cloud was actually a storm, a windstorm. Now, something very interesting about sand dunes. Sand dunes are made of what? Sand dunes are mostly formed by a balanced combination of wind, water, and sediment. The wind drives the sand deposits onto each other, and it slowly forms a mound over time. It takes time to build a mound. So again, there is a clear link between time and sand in this surah, the keeping of sand. I even thought of the keeping of time when you're turning a sand, I don't know what they're called. But when you turn it and they're at the top for that minute, it seems like you have all the time in the world, because the sand is, oh look, it's moving so slowly, it's moving so slowly. And then it gets to about a quarter left. Then it moves really fast. It's this sense of approaching doom. It's usually we use these things to keep time when we're playing a game, right? And so, hurry up, you have to answer the question. At the beginning, the person is just taking their time and doing the game properly at their leisurely speed. And all of a sudden, time runs out. And it is the warner who knows that the sand is moving at a consistent speed the whole time, and knows that you don't have a lot of time to begin with. He knows it, and she knows it. And that's why they're urgently telling you, you got to get it together. You got to realize, come on, you don't have a lot of time. But that only works really towards the end. But then towards the end, there's no time to start building anything. So you can't score the points necessary to build your foundation. SubhanAllah, I mean, I don't know. So what is a dune? A dune looks like a mountain-like structure. Mountain-like structures in the Quran are all over the place, and they tend to usually mean this is something powerful and rooted, and that is why it's used as a metaphor when the mountain goes crumbling over and over in the Quran. That's why the people of the Valley of Hijr built their houses in the mountains, because they thought that that means that they're firmly rooted and they're far away from danger, etc., etc. This same motif takes place in this surah. The sand dunes are shaped like mountains that make you feel that they are strong and powerful and they've been there forever. But what happens when the desert becomes too dry and the wind comes? The sand dunes shift and they move. Now, beforehand, when it was a little bit wetter, the sand dunes change and shift over time very slowly. But the more that they don't have the water that feeds the ground to build the sediment, suddenly the sand dunes take a completely different shape, and the old topography is destroyed, and whatever was built there is full of sand and leveled. You can't find it. You'd have to excavate it years and years later. Until this day, they're excavating places like in Hadramaut or in Egypt or wherever else is full of sand. This is the parable and the power of the sand dunes. What are our structures built on? Are they built on the substance of creation? The substance of creation, which we said in the early part of the surah was haqq, moral responsibility. The air and the earth and the animals and the trees and the grass and magnetism and the law of thermodynamics and the law of gravity all are subservient to what? Who put them in motion? Can you even replicate it? Probably not. And if God allows you to replicate it, He is allowing your senses to be deluded into making you think that you have power over it. And this surah talks about how those senses of vision and sight and hearts are deluded by your ego because they're ruled by fear and anxiety. I want to contrast the commencement speech that was given by the fellow, the tech bro type fellow from Ohio State, with a very moving scene that I saw this morning. Probably most of you saw it. I want us to turn our attention very briefly before I close to the case of Asna Tabassum, which I'm sure you have heard of by now, given that several weeks ago we heard some news. Asna was found to be the was chosen to be the valedictorian amongst a plethora of other candidates by USC itself. She was a biomedical engineering major with a minor in resistance to genocide. Yes, that is a real minor. I was in shock. The only reason I found that part out, I should have been reading more carefully when I was reading about her a few weeks ago. The only reason I found that part out was because Asna was in of course, let me back up so it's a little more clear. Asna is chosen as valedictorian for USC, a great institution, scholarly, etc., etc. And she's slated or scheduled to speak as the valedictory address, as they say, on May 10th, which is today, but it was canceled. Why was it canceled? Her speech was canceled because Zionists said they felt unsafe about whatever was going to come out of her mouth. They don't even know. There was no speech. The speech didn't exist. But they put so much pressure on USC that USC canceled the speech and said, no valedictorian speech this year. Yes, you have a 3.9 GPA in biomedical engineering, and you're the most, all of the things that make you a valedictorian, but we don't want to hear you talk. Please don't speak. So Asna was part of a student recognition ceremony. I've written here, a student award ceremony, where she was honored, amongst other students, honored by her peers. When her name was read, everybody roared with applause, and the announcer then said what it was that she graduated in. And he said, she is graduating with a degree in biomedical engineering and a minor in resistance to genocide. And I thought, wow, that's so cute. How did she manage to add that into there? Like, I'm resisting genocide as part of my education. But that wasn't a joke. It's for real. USC has a minor in resisting genocide, which includes classes that she must have taken, that includes classes on the Holocaust, on the Native American genocide, on the genocide in Darfur in Sudan, and the like. SubhanAllah. No wonder they didn't want her to talk. She was very, She was very, trained to speak about this particular subject, and they couldn't risk to have her. I was very moved this morning because I saw this video and it brought me to tears, because during this ovation, she sat down and thanked everyone. But when she sat down, the rest of the crowd said, "That's not enough." And they stood up, and in unison, they clapped and roared and cheered on their leader. And it was very overwhelming. I still haven't been able to kick the overwhelming mixture of grief and excitement that I saw in this unanimous voice of support for a student who clearly represented the student body in a moral, real way. In a real way. She was the commencement speaker. And look at the power that she delivered without even uttering a single word. I'm very proud of the bright youth in our country who have chosen to resist hatred and imperialism with uncompromising dedication to rebuilding a foundation of morality and righteousness in our society. These are the folks that actually understand who and what God is. They are doing the work of affirming. And it's our job as Muslims, now check yourself, do you really fully affirm purely God's attributes? Or are you in a partnership between yourself and yourself? Are you splitting between yourself and God? Are you giving God lip service? Be very, very careful. Because if the storm cloud comes and you are a Muslim and you are in conflict about who God is, but the one that you call kafir has no moral quandaries about what is right and wrong, I invite you to think about who is the punishment for. Astaghfirullah li wa lakum. As'alullah yastajib lakum. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma ighfir lana warhamna wa ihdina sirat al-mustaqim. Ya Rabb, I ask you to bless all the young graduates on this day, all of those who have dedicated their lives to justice and to learning and to your path and to growing closer and closer to you, Ya Rabb, such that you might guide them. They come to you, Ya Rabb, such that you might guide them on the path in which they can build a foundation. Help them to build a foundation, Ya Rabb, that will be the path forward upon which our youth will build the structures of equity and justice, the institutions that represent, Ya Rabb, help them to build the institutions that represent their values, and allow us to stand up against the falsehood of the institutions that are tyrannizing our children and our communities. Ya Rabbil Alameen. وصلي وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وأقم الصلاة.